So we previously talked about Yu Kwan Soon, this young provincial girl who is, in part through Protestant Christianity, is able to be plugged in this missionary network and become active in politics. I now want to kind of think a little bit more about how Korean Protestants would apply their religion to understanding the situation that they were in, and how to kind of get past it. So trying to look more at this in terms of kind of ideas, particularly Protestant Christian ideas. So this man here is named Kil Sunju. He's an early convert to Protestant Christianity and we become a minister. And he was active in the Great Revival, right? So this is someone who has theological training and who is going to participate and become an early Christian leader. Now, I don't want to put politics against religion, right? Because he was a signer of the March 1st, 1919 Declaration of Independence, right? Remember, he was one of 17 who signed. My goal here is not to try and put these things as opposites. Rather, I want us to see how Protestant Christians could respond in ways that weren't directly political. But this is not a guy who's against politics, right? He does become actively involved in politics. But we're in this time period between 1910 and 1919, right? So we're going back a little bit. This period of colonial rule when Japan is kind of controlling everything, when Koreans are very limited of what they can do. And Kil Sunju looked around and he said, you know what? Our nation is really suffering. Our nation is suffering a lot. But we live in a time of censorship when I can't really talk about it. So if I'm going to talk about it, I can't talk about it directly. I have to talk about it indirectly. And he's going to write this book called The Attainment of All Things in 1916. So I want to stress, this is before the March 1st independence movement. Right? So this guy will eventually sign the Declaration of Independence in March in 1919. He will participate in that movement. But beforehand, he's trying to figure out, how can I express the suffering that we Koreans are undergoing during a time of severe censorship? How do I do that? And he's going to do that through Christian literature, by writing a book from a Protestant Christian perspective that is not directly political, but that still shares some political ideas. And he's going to base his book off something called Pilgrim's Progress. I don't know how popular this book is today. It used to be very popular, but basically it is a book written in the 17th century that looks at a kind of metaphorical, symbolic journey of a Christian going from being tempted away from Christianity to being able to embrace it. And basically there's this kind of, and obtain salvation. And I want to stress, if you read this novel, it's not like a realistic novel. It's not intended to be. It has all these kind of weird things happening. You'll have a person who will just show up and they represent something. They symbolize something. It's not like a real individual person. It's meant to be read metaphorically. So it makes it kind of a fun read because there's all this wacky stuff in a sense that happens because it's not meant to be realistic. It's almost kind of like a serious cartoon, if that makes sense. And that's what Kil Sunju, he takes this, and this is a book written in England in like the 17th century. He reads this, it's popular among Protestant Christians at this time, and is going to say, well, I'm going to rewrite this for a Korean audience. And it's interesting because he talks about the primary enemy that prevents you from becoming a good Christian in his story is sloth. And I don't mean like sloth the animal. He means sloth, laziness. Right. Remember earlier we talked about one thing that was understood by Protestant Christian missionaries that would transform Korea, and by many of these Koreans themselves, was they said, we will become more moral. We will become diligent people who work hard. That will make our country rich and strong. Right. Protestant Christianity will help us to do that. So it's interesting that he chose sloth as his primary enemy. And the sloth tries to prevent the protagonist, from entering the kingdom of attainment. And in this book, Kil Sunju talks about how sloth destroys many things, including nations. Remember, sloth here means laziness, but it can be overcome by diligence and faith in Christ. And what's interesting is throughout this book also, there's this kind of affirmation of a narrative of fall and redemption, right? That there's the very strong ideas, especially in Protestant Christianity in general, but especially I think Protestant Christianity, that we human beings are fallen, but that we can be redeemed through Jesus Christ. And you see that narrative here in this book, what's striking is that it's understood that it's not just an individual, but the nation can fall and be redeemed by Christ. So just as I might become a sinner and need Christ's forgiveness, well, I mean, everyone in Christianity is understood as needing forgiveness, but let's say I do something and I fall, and I do something terrible, and terrible things happen to me as a result. God is there. I can be forgiven and be redeemed. There's this idea that this is applied not just to the individual, but Korea, right? Korea fell and has suffered a great deal, but it can be redeemed as well. So the story of salvation is not just read on an individual level, but also on a national level. And what's fascinating in this book, there's all this kind of symbolic geography. So Kil Sunju talks about how the protagonist has to cross over the mountain of suffering to enter the kingdom of attainment. Right? That's what he's trying to do. Right. So there's this idea he has to go up this mountain, and in Korea it's like 80% mountain. So that's why, you can see this kind of application here of Koreans to their context, right? It talks about the mountain of suffering, and you enter this place called the kingdom of attainment. And you may say, well, is that like the kingdom of God? And in a sense, but the kingdom or is that heaven? Well, what it is, the kingdom of attainment is an ideal nation state. It's what Korea would look like once it becomes independent. And then after you attain the kingdom of heaven, then you go to the kingdom of eternal life, heaven. Right? So there's this interesting idea that this isn't just a story of me being saved, of me being able to go to heaven. No, it's a story where if I follow Jesus, I can fix Korea and develop it into an independent country where everything's going to be great, and then I'll die and go to heaven. Right? So there's this idea that through Jesus, you can obtain personal and national salvation. So very interesting, I think, metaphorical book. Now, remember, Kil Sunju, he wanted to say these things. He couldn't because he was censored, but then later on he will help sign the the Korean Declaration of Independence and be a little bit more overtly political until that movement is crushed. So Kil Sunju is working before the Declaration of Independence of 1919, trying to express his ideas when Korea is having difficulties. And then he signs the Declaration of Independence. And what I want to stress here, the movement gets crushed, right? The March movement is crushed. Koreans, especially Korean Protestant Christians, had hoped that the movement would lead to independence. It didn't. And there's this question then, what went wrong? Right. So remember Catholics, we talked about how earlier Father Andrew Kim Dae-gun, they get their first Catholic priest. They're so happy. And then he gets arrested and is going to be killed. And the Catholics are like, we've been working so hard just to try and get the sacraments. The government keeps persecuting us. Why doesn't God stop this? And Father Andrew Kim Dae-gun, while he's in a prison cell waiting to be tortured and executed, tries to answer that question, right? We talked about that answer before. Protestant Christians face a similar question. What went wrong? How do we make sense of this? We thought that if we converted to this new religion, we thought God would protect us. It would transform our country, but the Japanese took us over. And then we tried to struggle for our independence, and that went wrong too. What happened? Right? The Christians have to kind of think about how do we deal with this? Why doesn't God help us? And there's this pastor named Kim Ik-tu. And Kim Ik-tu is an interesting guy because he is seen as a miracle worker. He's seen as someone who is able to heal people, or rather, I should say, he's seen as someone whose prayers God will hear and heal people. And this leads to the compilation of a text called A Testament of Miracles in the Chosun Jesus Church. Chosun, I won't go into the details here because it will go on forever, but Chosun is the name for Korea. So we can also say the Korean Jesus Church or just Korean Christian Church. And this book is basically a compilation of healings, miracles of healings associated with this pastor. So basically, it's an interesting book because it's organized by region, and it's just a list of people that claim that they were healed by this man. And what happens is this allows for Korea to be presented as a special place, as a place where God's healings are going on. And like I said, this book it's an interesting book because it's not meant to be like a narrative. It's not a story. It is organized in a, like I said, by region. And it's basically all these different testimonies and these witnesses who claim that they have either experienced or witnessed healing. And the discussions are very interesting because a lot of times they focus on physical suffering. So these will be people who have a lot of either wounds or illnesses that for whatever reason are not being cured by traditional medicine or by modern medicine. These are often very painful. They can it's often very the descriptions of the illnesses, you feel exhausted reading this thing, because they talk about how these people are just in so much pain. Sometimes they literally can't walk, and in particular they look at humiliating illnesses that involve continuous bleeding, illnesses that result in wounds that smell bad, illnesses that disfigure a person's face. Those kinds of things. They focus a lot on those kinds of illnesses and the idea that they are being cured by God through this pastor, Kim Ik-tu. And in particular, they try and play on biblical themes. I think this is really important. So if you're not familiar with this image, a lot of you can probably guess what this image is about. But if you're not familiar with it, there's a story in the Bible that Jesus is walking through a crowd, and there's a woman who has a it's very sad. Basically, she's menstruating and has menstruated for years, and she can't stop. Right, like they describe it as a hemorrhage, but that's how I understand it, is that she is undergoing vaginal bleeding, which, as you can guess, to do that for years and years and years would be very a miserable experience. In addition, that makes her unclean in this time period. In traditional Jewish law, my understanding is a woman who's menstruates is considered unclean, and that's why she has this idea. She says, if I can just touch Jesus, I'll be healed. And she touches him, and he doesn't. Apparently she's like kind of sneaks up on him and touches him, and it's interesting because he says I felt power go out from me, and then she feels she's instantly healed, but isn't worried that Jesus is going to be mad at her. But the key thing I just want to emphasize about this story is there's not just a sense of physical illness being healed, but this idea of overcoming humiliation. Right, this is a woman who has been ostracized, who's been treated badly, during a time, and this is terrible. I mean, just think about what this poor woman's undergoing. But instead of being supported, she's just ostracized and treated badly. And a lot of the healings that are described in this text are like this. Right, a lot of these healings are like this. And now this is clear, and this is very important, that the book does not say that Kim Ik-tu can do anything. It says, it talks about how some people aren't healed. And usually it explains this by saying that it depends on the person's faith and how much they believe in God. But also sometimes God just heals some people and he doesn't heal others. And we're not supposed to be bothered by that, according to the explanation of this book, because these miracles are meant to be signs. Right? It's not simply that God feels bad for someone and wants to heal them. The idea here is that these signs are these miracles are signs by which God communicates. Right. I want to read to you an excerpt from the text. We know that he, and they mean God, would not wish to show these things to us haphazardly, but that God must have a holy intent. Of what nature are the current times? Following last year's March 1st movement, believers throughout the country have been subjected to great suffering. Remember, not only did the Japanese respond violently, they especially targeted Christians. And there are many who are starving because of tribulation and famine. Who or what comfort and strength the faith of believers facing such who or what might comfort and strengthen the faith of believers facing such suffering, poverty, and tribulation? For this reason, God has revealed these miracles, saying, you believers who suffer, I am with you. Right. So the idea here is that miracles show that these miracles of healing that people are claiming to have witnessed shows God's existence and presence. Right. There you see that the church is suffering under severe persecution. Things are really tough for us, but God exists. He's present with us. God is with Korean people as they suffer. So there's this kind of sense, it's this question, why are we suffering? Why are we going through this? It's not necessarily clear, but it's important to know that God has not given up on us. God is with us, and one day this suffering will end. Right? One day God will fix things. We just need to endure the suffering for now. In God's good time, everything will turn out okay. We just have to be patient and endure, because God has not abandoned us. He's with us in his great wisdom. We will eventually be fine. The suffering one day will end and we will have salvation. And there's something else, though, that's going on here that I think is also really important. miracles today means the miracles in the Bibles must have been true. That's the argument. They make that. I'm not saying that. This is what the book says. The book says there are miracles today. There are people today who tell you that the miracles in the Bible are false. They are wrong. We know that the Bible is true. The miracles in the Bible are true because we see those same miracles today, right? And there's this idea that God is more powerful than civilization. So it's kind of interesting, right? I love this about history, is that there's these layers of meaning. So you have some people who become Protestant Christian in part because they believe that Protestant Christianity is the source of Western civilization and Western power. And that's one reason they should believe. But then you have these other Protestant Christians who say, no, this shows that God is more powerful than civilization, because over and over again, they give instances where someone could not be cured by modern medicine, or traditional Korean medicine, but was cured through prayer. Now, I want to stress, the book is not saying never go to a doctor. They don't say that. What they do say, though, is that why would we only go to the doctor and not pray? And we know God is more powerful than that. And this is important because one thing that Japan tried to justify colonizing Korea over was saying, we know Koreans are backwards, their country is weak, they're unenlightened, we will take them over and civilize them. And part of that was bringing in modern medicine. So by saying, modern medicine is not as powerful as you think it is, what they're also saying is Japan does not have the right to come in and try and fix us and colonize us under this justification that they're going to bring us modern medicine. But the idea here is you have these people who are suffering a great deal, who things are just not working out for them, and there's this idea, and who are being challenged and criticized for their beliefs and practices. They're finding some meaning here. And this was also meant to kind of meet the challenge posed by educated skeptics, both inside and outside of religion, who said, they would write these books and these articles. And I want to stress in this time period, this is going to eventually include like socialists and communists who argue that religion is false. It's all fake. It's all made up. The Bible is just a book of fairy tales. And the idea here is this book is saying is like, all this is false because these miracles happen today, right? Miracles do happen. That means there's a God. Hold out against these criticisms. Right, that's kind of the idea here. Now, we're going to skip past a lot of political history, but I do want to note, and this is going to be very important for understanding things going forward, is that in the 1930s, Japan is going to become increasingly militaristic, and there's going to be an emphasis on the Japanese religion of Shinto. And Shinto is, it literally means way of the gods, but there's this idea that there's all these gods that you should worship. And the Japanese emperor is understood to be a living god. And basically in the 1930s, the Japanese government wanted to force Koreans to worship these Shinto gods. They wanted them to bow towards the emperor's portrait or towards the emperor's palace in Japan. And these men up here, those are Koreans who are being conscripted. They're being drafted to fight in Japan's war. And as part of their training before they're sent off, they are bowing at a Shinto shrine. Now, to me, this is very obviously religious worship because you've got a shrine with gods in it. That's what the people who believe in it claim. There's gods in the shrine, and you're supposed to go and bow to the gods to show your respect. That seems to me to be religious. But the Japanese government said that this is a civil ceremony. It's not religious. Right? That's what the Japanese government said. This is a civil ceremony. It's not religious. And so you should do it. Right? This is just showing, this is like singing the national anthem, right? It's not a big deal. Just show that you're loyal to Japan by doing this because it's not a religious act. So this put Protestant Christians were in a difficult position because this seemed like a religious act, but they knew that if they resisted, they could get in a lot of trouble with the Japanese government. Catholicism is interesting because Catholics in Korea initially said this is wrong. We should not do this. Remember, they had resisted ancestor rights. But what's going to happen is they're going to end up flip-flopping because the Catholic Church, i.e. the Pope, will accept Japan's interpretation that these are civil rights, will issue a ruling that says these are civil rights, and then Catholics are kind of like, oh, I guess we have to do it then, because that's how our church works. So the Catholics initially are united opposing it, but then have to switch their position because the head of the Catholic Church says, nope, you should do this. But Protestants are divided, right? Protestants are divided. I'll come back to them momentarily, but I do want to mention a little bit about Catholics during the colonial period. Catholics, and this is a picture of Myeongdong Cathedral with Japanese flags in front of it. The Catholic Church during this time period is very poor. Catholic missionaries are constantly complaining about how Protestant missionaries have a lot more resources, a lot more funding than they have, so it's very difficult to compete. And one thing I think is fascinating is that a Protestant missionary who came to Korea, American Protestant missionary who came to Korea, got off the boat, just a new guy, he got paid more than the Catholic bishop in Korea, which I think is really striking. And the Catholic Church was also very weak in comparison. Remember, it had endured persecution for decades, had lost a lot of people, and was really on the margins of society. Like I say, it was comparatively poor. Its theology tended to support that. It was very inward-looking. It said that, this world is a world of suffering and difficulty, and we just have to endure. And so it did not it was not comfortable with ideas of modernity. And so you don't have a similar kind of development, this Catholic idea that you had with the Protestants. And this leads to what we might call a ghetto church, a church that tried to stay away from society, was on the margins, was not interested in participating in society, and couldn't really do a whole lot. There will be a transformation later, but that's something we'll talk about another time. Now, what's eventually going to happen, though, is that the Koreans, they're going to endure this, but eventually Japan is defeated in World War II, which means Korea will become free, will become an independent country, but almost immediately after that, it gets divided right into North and South Korea along the 38th parallel. And one thing I want to note that's fascinating, I haven't talked a lot about this so far, but the center of Korean Protestant Christianity was in Pyongyang, was in North Korea. It was in North Korea where you had most Protestants. And a lot of the Protestant churches that were established eventually in South Korea, that was by refugees from North Korea who were pushed out by the communist government. But in North Korea, you're going to have a communist government. In South Korea, you're going to have an anti-communist government. And what will happen is Pyongyang, which used to be known as the Jerusalem of the East because there were so many Protestant Christians there, and there were also a good number of Catholics, it will become the capital of the Communist Democratic People's Republic, which will do its best to destroy Christianity as well as Buddhism and other organized religion, and essentially establish this gets complex because there's this argument whether or not North Korea has there's this kind of official religion or not. I don't want to get into that debate. I do want to note that those are the two leaders there, and you've got people bowing in front of them, and they're often treated with a kind of religious respect. Even if they're not necessarily given divine powers, they're understood as being amazing human beings. And there's the first leader, Kim Il-sung, and his son, Kim Jong-il. They're on the third Kim at the time of the recording of this video, Kim Jong-un. But the key thing here is that you've got this, it's this kind of crazy thing about history is that this area that had been the center of Korean Christianity is no longer that center and is officially an atheist government. So I want to talk a little bit then about a man whose life kind of goes across the colonial period and into that early Korean period, and that's a man named Son Yong-won. And I think he really typifies, he's kind of, what can I say? We'll see his story and why I would want to tell it. I think he's a good person to kind of end our section on Korean Protestant on. He kind of stands, I think, for a lot of the best, you could say, in the tradition. This is a guy, even if you're not a Christian, I think you could really respect some of the things he does. He was a Christian pastor who worked with people suffering from Hansen's disease. Hansen's disease was popularly known as leprosy. And of course, it's Hansen's disease. Now there's a lot of good ways to treat it. Then not as much. It creates a lot of human suffering because it's a disease where basically your body rots. So it creates a lot of pain and suffering and disfigures people who suffer it. And he chose to work with people suffering from that disease. So, in my book, that's a point for someone, right? If they say, you know what, I don't want to live a comfortable, easy life. I want to go help people who are suffering. Son Yong-won, got to give the guy credit for that. His same Christian faith that led him to help the people with Hansen's disease is also going to lead him to refuse to participate in Shinto worship. And he spoke out against it. Remember, I said that this was understood to be by the government to be a secular act to worship at Shinto shrines. He said, no, it's not. And so they arrested him and imprisoned him for that. So he's someone who's also going to be opposed to Japanese rule in that way. Now, he will survive prison and will try and rebuild his ministry following the liberation from Japan. But in 1948, where he's working, and he's someone who's working in South Korea, there will be a pro-communist rebellion in the southwest in Korea where he is working. And during that time period, two of his sons will be killed. His two sons are both going to die. They're going to be killed by these pro-communist people. And what's amazing is that he preached at his children's funeral, in which he gave thanks that they were martyrs, which as a parent, I think that's a very difficult thing to do, right? To go to my son's funeral, my children are murdered, and to say these guys are, my sons are martyrs. I'm very thankful to God that my sons died as martyrs. My instinct is to say, I want my sons back, right? I don't, but that's just, again, that's a testament, I think, to this man's faith that he could do that. And what's really makes this story, I think, interesting and in a sense amazing is that the man who was behind the murder of his sons was a student actually about his son's age, but he had been a communist sympathizer who participated in the revolt. He was found, and the Korean government was going to kill him, was going to execute him because, he had kind of committed murder. And Pastor Son said, no, please don't kill him. Please spare his life, right? So the father who had lost his two sons is speaking up and asking that the man behind the death of his two sons not be executed. And he actually essentially forgave him and adopted this young man who would himself eventually convert to Christianity and become a pastor. And that's, in a sense, we could say that's a nice ending, right? In a sense, right? The guy doesn't get executed. And I think that says something about Pastor Son, that he was willing to not only forgive the man who killed, who was played a key role in the death of his sons, but also that he worked actively to get his life spared and looked after him after he died. Unfortunately for Pastor Son, when the Korean War began and North Korea invaded, the North Korean communists captured him, and he would also die a martyr for his faith, like his sons, which I think is tragic, but is also probably how he would have wanted to go.